20 years from now, almost everything you own today will feel old. Your phone, your car, your computer. The things that feel advanced today will eventually become ordinary, then forgotten. Something newer always arrives, something better, faster, cheaper, replacing what came right before it. And sometimes the companies behind those products disappear with them. This isn't sad exactly. It's simply how technology has always worked, for a very long time. But that leads to a more interesting question. If every product eventually becomes old, what is actually worth building for the long run? Most people build a product, sell it, and hope it lasts as long as possible. One person seems to be building something much harder to replace, hidden underneath all of those products. So what is Elon Musk actually building that doesn't go out of date? It isn't a product at all. Think about the phone sitting in your pocket right now. In 10 years, it will feel slow, outdated, almost strange compared to whatever replaces it. That's not a flaw. That's simply how every single product, eventually, works. So if products always fade, what kind of thing can actually grow stronger over decades? To understand that, we need to look beyond the products themselves. Look at the companies most people already know. Tesla started as an electric car company. SpaceX started as a rocket company. But over time, both companies have grown far beyond their original products. Tesla now builds batteries and solar panels, moving well beyond cars alone. SpaceX now runs Starlink, a satellite internet system, moving well beyond rockets alone. But this leads to a deeper question. What if the real advantage was never the car or the rocket itself? What if it's actually the capability to build them, again and again, better each time? A capability is different from a product. A product eventually becomes old and gets replaced. A capability can grow stronger over time because every use becomes another chance to improve. This connects to another important shift in the way Musk seems to think. Timelines instead of schedules. Most people think about schedules, tasks to finish today, this week, or this month. Musk seems to think in timelines instead, a picture of what needs to exist years from now. Then, working backward from that picture, toward what needs to happen today to make it real. Think about how differently these two approaches actually feel, from the inside, day to day. A schedule feels urgent almost all the time. Today's list, this week's deadline, the next small fire to put out. A timeline feels quieter, but it asks much harder questions. It asks a bigger, more uncomfortable question. Are today's actions actually building toward that 20-year picture? Most people never stop long enough to genuinely ask that question about their own daily work. Keep these two ideas in mind. They explain a lot about how Musk approaches problems. For now, remember this simple contrast, because it shapes almost everything that follows in this story. Products fade. Capability, applied consistently, tends to compound instead, growing stronger with every use. To see why this matters, let's start with a pattern that causes many companies to fail. Many companies build one successful product, and for a while, everything seems to work perfectly. Then the market changes. A competitor arrives. The product slowly becomes outdated. Many of these companies quietly die around this exact moment, unable to build anything new. They spent everything on one product, and very little on the capability to build the next one. Musk's companies appear to follow a different approach from the beginning. He invests heavily in engineers and in the systems that allow those engineers to keep improving. Not just one car, but the capability to keep improving and building new ones for decades. This capability is the real asset. The car itself is simply today's version of it. But capability alone is not enough. The next question is, how far ahead you are able to think. Many people stop at one simple question. Can we actually build this? Musk's thinking seems to continue one step further, toward a question many people overlook. What happens next if this actually works? What if it works better than anyone expected? What happens if everyone else eventually builds the exact same thing too? This way of thinking is often called second-order thinking, looking beyond the first result and asking what happens next. Building one successful electric car matters. But what happens if every car eventually becomes electric? That question leads toward batteries, toward electricity, toward an entire energy system, not just one car. Second-order thinking tends to prepare you for a much bigger picture than first-order thinking ever does. This is where timelines become more than just a long-term vision. A schedule asks, what do I need to finish today or this week? A timeline asks something bigger. What needs to exist years from now for this future to become possible? Once you know that, today's schedule starts to look very different and often much more specific. Today's tasks become small, necessary steps toward that much larger 20-year picture. But thinking long-term does not mean predicting the future perfectly. It means building a system that can adapt when reality changes. Nobody can predict the future perfectly, no matter how intelligent they are. Musk's approach doesn't require perfect prediction. It requires building a system flexible enough to adapt, a system that can adjust as new information arrives, without collapsing completely every single time. That flexibility matters more over 20 years than any single accurate prediction ever could. Let's make this a little more concrete, with a simple, everyday example. Imagine two bakers, both opening a small shop on the exact same street, on the exact same day. One baker perfects a single recipe completely and sells only that one specific type of bread. The other baker builds something different, real skill in understanding flour, heat, timing, and flavor. For a while, both bakeries look successful, roughly equally, to anyone walking past them. Then tastes change, slowly, the way tastes always eventually do, in any market. The first baker struggles, because their entire business depended on one single, unchanging recipe. The second baker adapts quickly, because their real skill was never tied to just one recipe alone. That underlying skill, not any single loaf of bread, was the actual capability worth building. This simple story repeats itself, at a much larger scale, across Musk's companies and decisions. The specific car model matters less in the end than the manufacturing skill behind it. The specific rocket design matters less than the deep, reusable engineering knowledge that built it. This same idea becomes even clearer when we look at bigger decisions. Most people, faced with a decision, ask a single, natural question, almost automatically. Will this work? That question feels complete most days, and often it genuinely is enough. But for decisions at a much larger scale, that single question quietly misses something important. It misses everything that happens after the first success, once the idea actually starts working. Imagine a small company inventing a genuinely better, cheaper battery for the very first time. First-order thinking stops there. Great, we built a better battery. Let's sell it. Second-order thinking keeps going, a little further, into less obvious territory. If this battery really is better, what happens to the entire energy industry over the next decade? Will homes want to store their own energy? Will entire cities want to change how they get power? Suddenly, one small invention connects to an entire, much larger system, worth preparing for in advance. This is exactly the kind of thinking that pushed Tesla beyond cars, into energy more broadly. Not because cars stopped mattering, because the second-order consequences of good batteries mattered even more. Most competitors, focused narrowly on their original single product, rarely see this bigger picture in time. By the time they finally notice, the gap has often already grown far too wide to close. But ideas only matter when they lead to real decisions. And some of Musk's biggest decisions were also his riskiest ones. Musk chose industries that were considered some of the hardest to enter: electric cars, rockets, and satellites. At different points, many people questioned that decision, and honestly, their doubts were understandable. Why choose industries this difficult and expensive when easier opportunities existed elsewhere? Software companies, for comparison, often need very little money to start and can grow incredibly fast. Rockets and car factories need enormous amounts of money, time, and highly specialized engineering knowledge. For years, this looked like an unnecessarily difficult, perhaps even foolish, set of choices to outsiders. But over time, a different pattern began to appear across these difficult industries. The very difficulty that scared away so many competitors also protected the companies already inside it. A simple app can often be copied quickly, sometimes within just a few months. Building a reusable rocket or a massive battery factory takes years and enormous amounts of capital. Very few competitors are willing or even able to attempt that same difficult climb. But there is another side to choosing a difficult path: the fear that comes with it. Before major decisions, like risking nearly everything on a struggling rocket company, real fear was clearly present. Musk has spoken openly about the doubt and fear that came before some of his biggest risks. He didn't describe these moments as fearless, or effortless, or free of any real doubt. He described choosing to act anyway, despite that fear, rather than waiting for the fear to disappear first. That moment is worth looking at more closely. Picture the moment honestly: nearly all your money tied up in a project that could easily fail completely. Rockets exploding, publicly, more than once, right before your very last remaining attempt. Most reasonable advisors would have suggested stepping back, protecting what little money remained. Instead, the decision was to keep going, fully aware that failure was a real, immediate possibility. This wasn't confidence in a guaranteed outcome. There was no guarantee available, at any point. It was a willingness to risk real, serious consequences for a future that felt worth that risk. Looking back now, it's easy to see the decision as obvious because we know how the story ended. At the time, inside that moment, it looked exactly like what it was: a genuine, frightening gamble. Colleagues watching from outside often couldn't fully understand why anyone would accept that level of risk. From inside, though, the logic slowly became clearer, even if it never became fully comfortable. Easier industries invited easier competition, arriving quickly, from every direction, almost immediately. Harder industries invited almost no competition at all, at least not for a very long time. That absence of competition, uncomfortable as the difficulty was, started to look like its own kind of safety. Real courage in this story looked far less dramatic than movies usually make it appear. It looked like showing up, quietly, on another hard, uncertain day, and continuing anyway. Not once, but repeatedly, through many difficult days that slowly added up over time. And over time, that difficulty started to create something unexpected: an advantage. The difficulty itself became a barrier that few competitors were willing to face. The hardest, most expensive industries were never simply obstacles standing in the way of success. They were also a barrier, a challenge most competitors were never willing to take on. In business, this kind of protection has a simple name: a moat. An old castle used a moat, a deep ring of water, to keep enemies from easily reaching it. In business, a moat works in a similar way, except the protection comes from difficulty instead of water. Most companies try hard to avoid difficulty, searching instead for the easiest possible path forward. Musk's approach seems to do the opposite. He appears to choose difficult problems intentionally, not because difficulty is enjoyable, but because that difficulty can protect what gets built on the other side. Few competitors can raise enough money to build a serious rocket company from nothing. Even fewer are willing to spend years building before seeing meaningful returns. That difficulty, uncomfortable as it is, quietly becomes one of the strongest protections a company can have. This changes what courage actually means, in this specific context, more clearly than before. Courage here is not the absence of fear, or the feeling that everything will work out. It's choosing the hard, uncomfortable path anyway, specifically because so few others will choose it too. Over enough years, something interesting happens to a future built this patiently, this deliberately. It can start to feel less like a gamble, and more like the result of years of preparation. Not because success was ever guaranteed at any single point along the way, but because enough consistent building, year after year, made that future far more likely than not. Think about how strange this idea would sound to most business advice you've ever heard before. Most advice pushes you toward the easiest, fastest, least risky path available to you. This approach quietly does the opposite, on purpose, in a way that only makes sense over time. It asks, what is difficult enough that few competitors will ever bother trying to follow you there? That question feels uncomfortable, at first, because it seems to invite more risk, not less. But difficulty, chosen deliberately, behaves differently than difficulty that simply happens to you by accident. Chosen difficulty becomes a wall protecting you. Accidental difficulty just becomes an obstacle draining your energy. The moat only works, though, if you're willing to genuinely endure the difficulty for years without quitting early. A moat abandoned halfway through offers no protection at all to anyone standing inside it. This is why so few companies successfully copy this exact strategy, even after studying it closely. They see the eventual reward, but underestimate the many hard, uncertain years required to reach it. Most give up somewhere in the middle, right when the moat was almost finished being built. Over time, patience with difficult problems can become one of the rarest advantages anyone can build. But the bigger question is, how can this way of thinking change the choices we make in our own lives? You don't need to predict the future perfectly, because nobody can. You need a system flexible enough to adapt, and a timeline genuinely worth building toward. 3 simple ideas can help bring this way of thinking into everyday life. First, build capability, not just temporary results. Ask yourself, what skill is this task helping me build over time? If the answer is nothing, you may only be producing a result, not building a lasting ability. Second, think in timelines, not only today's list of urgent tasks. Ask yourself, what do I want my future self to have built 10 or 20 years from now? Then work backward from that picture, toward what today's small, specific tasks should actually be. Third, look for your own moat, the difficult skill or challenge most people avoid. Easy paths attract crowds of competitors quickly. Hard paths tend to protect whoever's willing to stay. Ask yourself, what difficult skill, if I patiently developed it, would most people give up on too early? Build capability. Think long-term. Turn difficult challenges into your advantage. Let's make each one a little more concrete before we move toward the end. Look back at something you built, finished, or accomplished recently. Did it build a lasting skill, or did it simply produce one temporary result, now already fading? Now think about your own personal timeline, honestly, over the next 10 or 20 years. What do you hope will be true by then? Not just today's tasks, but the bigger picture. Finally, think about something difficult you've been quietly avoiding for a while now. What if that exact difficulty is precisely where your own advantage is patiently waiting to be built? Asking these questions regularly slowly builds the same kind of long-term thinking we've explored today. They require patience and the willingness to think beyond today's problems. Start small, if you need to. Even a 5-year timeline is far better than no timeline at all. And when you look at the bigger picture, These small habits are exactly what create lasting systems. Now, if we step back and look at the bigger picture, a clearer pattern starts to appear. Tesla started as an electric car company, but its work has expanded far beyond cars. SpaceX began with rockets, but its systems eventually expanded into areas like satellite communication through Starlink. His work in artificial intelligence and robotics continues to challenge the old boundaries between industries. The old labels of car company, rocket company, or energy company become less important when you look at the larger system. What remains, underneath all of it, is the same capability, applied again and again, across new problems. Question old assumptions. Build the necessary system. Adapt it, patiently, as the real world changes around it. Repeat that process for years, and what once seemed impossible slowly starts to feel achievable. This is really the heart of the entire story we've explored today. More often, progress is limited by how willing people are to question the assumptions they have always accepted. Progress is limited more often by how many people are willing to actually question old assumptions, and by how many people are willing to keep building patiently until something that seemed impossible becomes normal. None of this required a perfect prediction of the future, made once, at the very beginning. It required a system built to adapt, a timeline worth chasing, and a moat worth defending patiently. Years from now, many ideas that seem impossible today may simply become part of everyday life. That quiet shift, from impossible to ordinary, is often where real progress happens. So, if we reduce this entire story to a few simple ideas, products eventually become outdated. Capability can continue growing. He thinks in long-term timelines, not only today's schedule. He chooses difficult problems where patience itself becomes an advantage. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was building anyway, despite it. His systems adapt to the future instead of trying to predict it perfectly. And the impossible becomes ordinary through decades of the same small, repeated habits. Before we go, let's remember today's key words. One more time, slowly. Capability. The ability to build and improve things over time, moat. A barrier that protects you specifically by being hard for others to cross. Timeline. The future you're building toward, not just today's simple to-do list. Consequence. What happens next, further down the line, if something actually succeeds? Courage. Acting despite real uncertainty, not the complete absence of fear. Adapt. Changing your system as the world changes, instead of predicting it perfectly. Inevitable. Something that feels almost certain because of the preparation behind it. Capability. Moat. Timeline. Consequence. Courage, adapt, inevitable. I'm really happy this story could be useful to you. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more stories about Elon Musk, comment Elon Musk below. We'll bring you more inspiring stories about his life, ideas, and mindset. See you in the next story.